€50 billion in unauthorized positions inside a major French bank without detection for over a year. When the bank discovered them, the unwinding alone crashed the market, €4.9 billion in losses. This is Jerome Kerviel and Societe Generale. The number was €50 billion and it was not 50 billion in losses. It was 50 billion in unauthorized market positions that Jerome Kerviel had accumulated inside Societe Generale's trading systems without his managers knowing and without the bank's risk systems catching it. And when the bank discovered the positions in January 2008 and began unwinding them over 3 days, the unwinding itself, the forced selling of €50 billion of equity futures contracts into a falling market, contributed to a significant market decline, and the losses from the unwinding totaled €4.9 billion, making it the largest rogue trading loss in history at the time. And the story of how one junior trader at a French bank accumulated positions equivalent to 1.5 times the bank's entire market capitalization, without detection, is a story about the specific blind spots that exist in financial institutions and how someone with sufficient technical knowledge can exploit them for years. Jerome Kerviel was born in 1977 in Pont-l'Abbé in Brittany, and he was not from a privileged background, and his mother was a hairdresser and his father was a blacksmith, and he studied finance at a regional university rather than at one of the elite French grandes écoles that traditionally supplied the most prestigious banking jobs. And when he joined Societe Generale in 2000, he began in the middle office, the compliance and risk monitoring function, rather than on the trading floor, and this was considered a less prestigious entry point, and Kerviel knew it and was determined to prove himself. And in 2005 he moved to the trading floor as a junior trader on the Delta 1 desk, the same type of desk as Kweku Adobali at UBS, dealing in equity index futures and exchange-traded products. His middle office experience, like Adobali's back office experience at UBS, gave Kerviel detailed knowledge of how Societe Generale's risk systems worked and crucially how they could be fooled. And from 2006 Kerviel began placing unauthorized directional bets on European equity indices, bets on whether the market would go up or go down. And to disguise these bets from the risk systems, he created fictitious offsetting positions, fake trades that would appear to hedge his real positions and keep his reported risk within his official limits. And he used his knowledge of the compliance systems to create these fictions in a way that would evade the automated checks that were supposed to catch exactly this kind of behavior. In 2007 Kerviel made a bold bet that European equity markets would fall, and this bet was correct. The markets did fall in 2007 as the subprime crisis began to bite, and Kerviel made approximately €1.4 billion in profit for Societe Generale through this unauthorized trading, though the bank was not aware the profit had come from unauthorized positions. And this success emboldened Kerviel, and by January 2008 he had accumulated positions worth approximately €50 billion, betting that European equity markets would continue to rise in the new year, a bet that would prove catastrophically wrong. On January 18, 2008, a routine compliance check at Societe Generale flagged a fictitious trade in Kerviel's book, and the investigation that followed quickly revealed the scale of what he had done, and the bank immediately convened an emergency meeting of senior management. And on Saturday, January 19, 2008, they informed the French banking regulator, and over the following 3 days, January 21 through January 23, 2008, Societe Generale began unwinding Kerviel's positions, selling €50 billion of equity futures into a market that was already falling, and the scale of the selling contributed to a dramatic market decline that week, which at the time was partly attributed to concerns about the American economy. The full story of the Societe Generale unwind did not become public until January 24, 2008. The losses from the unwind totaled €4.9 billion, the largest rogue trading loss recorded at that time, and Societe Generale raised €5.5 billion in emergency capital from its shareholders to cover the losses. And the announcement of both the fraud and the capital raising on January 24, 2008 was one of the most dramatic single-day disclosures in European banking history. Jerome Kerviel was arrested in January 2008, and his trial became one of the most followed in French legal history, partly because of the fascinating question that it raised about institutional responsibility. Kerviel argued throughout his trial and his subsequent appeals and public statements that his managers had known or should have known what he was doing, that the culture of the trading floor had encouraged risk-taking, and that results had been celebrated without sufficient scrutiny of how they were achieved, and that making him the sole repository of blame for what had happened was a profound injustice given the institutional failures that had allowed it. In October 2010, Kerviel was convicted of breach of trust, forgery, and unauthorized use of computer systems and sentenced to 5 years in prison, 3 years suspended, and ordered to repay 4.9 billion euros to Societe Generale, which everyone acknowledged was an entirely symbolic sum since Kerviel had no realistic ability to pay it, and in subsequent years the question of whether Societe Generale itself bore any legal responsibility for the losses was litigated extensively in the French courts, and in 2016 a French court reduced Kerviel's civil liability from 4.9 billion to 1 million euros, effectively accepting that the bank's own failures had contributed substantially to the loss. Though this decision was subsequently overturned and the legal proceedings around the question of institutional versus individual liability continued for years. Kerviel served approximately 2.5 years in prison, and after his release he became one of the most vocal critics of the banking system, writing a book about his experience, speaking publicly about the culture that he argued had created the conditions for his trading, and he acquired a significant following among people who were skeptical of the narrative that he alone bore responsibility for what had happened. So what is the real lesson of Jerome Kerviel and Societe Generale? And the lesson exists on two levels, and the first is technical. The same pattern that appeared at Barings with Nick Leeson and at UBS with Kweku Adobelai appeared at Societe Generale with Kerviel, a trader who began in the risk and operations functions before moving to the trading floor, who used their knowledge of how the systems worked to evade the systems, who created fictitious offsetting trades to hide real positions, and whose losses grew faster than they could be recovered. And the fact that this same pattern appeared at three major banks separated by years suggests that the lessons of each case were not being systematically absorbed and applied across the industry. The second level is about the institutional versus individual framing of financial crime. Kerviel accumulated 50 billion euros in positions over more than a year, positions that at various points generated enormous profits that the bank collected without asking how they had been achieved. And the question of whether an institution can legitimately accept the profits of unauthorized activity while placing all the blame for the losses on the individual who generated both is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered, and it goes to the heart of how responsibility is distributed in financial institutions where the culture encourages risk-taking and the controls are supposed to provide the constraint. That is the capital case. Subscribe to the capital case because the next case is already waiting.